welcome to the March or Die Show. Very glad to have you joining me today, and looking forward to sharing with you a wonderful conversation with a longtime friend of mine. Before we jump into that, though, I would like to remind you, as I do every episode, if you have not yet subscribed, do that right now. You can subscribe right now, and that would be awesome. Subscribing helps you. You know when the content is pushed out, and it helps me. It helps me to be able to have the resources I need to produce more content like this. So please go ahead and do that and share that content out with others. And then take some time, go to marchordie.com, marchordie.com. That is the website for this show. Archived episodes are there. The store is there. A lot of great content there for you. So please check that out. Today, I have the opportunity, the privilege of sharing with you a conversation that I had with a friend of mine. Greg Drobney is with us. And Greg and I met about 10 years ago, maybe a little longer than 10 years ago. Greg was in the United States Army and just has a fascinating personal story. And throughout his time after the military, he has continued to serve in various roles that serve those who are coming out of the military, veterans, and even some folks who are still in, of course. And he's been very involved in that world of veterans, serving veterans, and veterans helping veterans. And he's been involved in it really longer than most folks that I know. We look at the veteran community now, and there are so many resources for veterans. If you go back about 10 years or more, that was not the case. And Greg has been involved in writing and helping veterans, writing to and for and helping veterans for a very long time. And I appreciate him coming on today. We talk about transition. We talk about the military and how things have changed, and really the future going forward as we look down the road. How do those who are in the military now, those who are transitioning, those who are trying to find a renewed purpose and a renewed sense of direction after their service, how do they find that? Where do they find that? We talk about that. Great conversation. Very happy to be able to share that with you. And we will jump into that in just a moment. Greg, welcome to the show, man. It's been a long time since I've seen you in person. We've communicated over the last 10 years, but we haven't really talked like this. So it's good to see you, man.
Good to see you, and thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, you were just mentioning it's been 10 years, and time, man, it goes so fast. It's hard to believe. But lots happened in 10 years. You look exactly the same, though. So,
as do you, maybe even better. You might have even improved. I don't know.
If you can't lie to people that you've known for a long time, then who can you lie to, right?
Exactly.
There are a lot of things I'd like to talk about. You've been in the veteran space for a long time. In fact, we connected because of I won't say it was the veteran space per se, but you're writing for
Ranger Up.
I don't know. Yep. What would you call that? It's not a veteran magazine, but it was
a mill blog. I mean, that was the term at the time. It was a mill blog, and at the time, the Rhino Den was the most popular mill blog on the internet. I mean, we were the number one game in town, and then later things like Task and Purpose came along and kind of took that role. But at that time, I would say 2011, 12, 13. It was a big site. It was huge, but it was primarily a clothing company, and the blog existed to kind of draw attention to the brand.
And because there weren't a lot of things like that. Now we think of Black Rifle, right? And some of these like mega vet focused companies. It just really didn't exist. And in fact, Ranger Up, I mean, they were selling T-shirts, but they were huge, and that was pre-9 Line and all the other companies that exist today. But we met because of that kind of that space, right? That's what connected us. Was we're all kind of involved in the veteran space. But things have changed a lot, and you and I were just talking about this a little bit ago. For people who were veterans, those who had served in combat, primarily in Iraq and Afghanistan, there just weren't a lot of places to meet up, right? And so that's why things like Ranger Up and some of these kind of lesser known blog sites and those connections happened. And it happened, organically, because that's where we could talk about some of these things. And then we started to get to know each other. And then a lot of that's been professionalized. But back then, there wasn't that. Those platforms didn't really exist the way they do today. And real conversations were being had, but they were being had kind of on the side, right? You were writing about those things, and other people were writing about them. We have a mutual friend, Matt Height. He was writing about stuff, right? And it's all like people knew about it kind of, but not really. And a lot of the names that were being used were pseudonyms. And so
Mine included.
So conversations about trauma and conversations about, transitioning out of the military, these were not conversations people were having, and we were trying, but it wasn't what it is today. And you were kind of on the forward edge of that. So I'd like to talk about some of those things as it pertains to the military community and transitioning and what a lot of that looks like. But for those that aren't familiar with you, tell us your story, how you got into the military, where you served, when you served, and then what your transition out looked like.
Sure. So as briefly as possible, because these stories can get long and of course longer over time, because of course I did more and, saved more lives and jumped out of more planes than I actually did.
Exactly.
But the reality is, so I'm a bit of a unique story in that I didn't even join the military until I was 28 years old. That's when September 11th came along. And I was at a stage in my life where I just didn't know what to do with my life. Military was already on my radar. I'd already considered it. I was thinking about it. 9/11 happens and it was like, that's what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And signed up with the old Ranger contract and went to go go do the whole airborne Ranger thing. Subsequently broke my hip with 2 days left in the Ranger indoctrination program.
Wow.
And ended up a Ranger training brigade for almost 3 years down in Florida. Got out once, came back and did some security contracting, came back in as a PSYOP guy. I did a tour as a PSYOP team chief in Iraq in 2008 and 9. Then I was out permanently, went into the political field, actually, completely by happenstance. It wasn't something I sought out. I wasn't trying to work in politics. It was a connection of a friend. Suddenly I find myself working in the world of politics.
Yeah.
Learned a lot. I don't recommend it to anyone.
That's one of the things you learned.
That's one of the things I learned was it's not for me.
Yeah.
But it was around that time that I started writing for Ranger Up that you mentioned earlier. And it was this writing contest that they had proposed. And basically they never told me I lost. They gave the official job of editor of their website to a different guy. And I think he actually came through Mighty Oaks at one point, Rob Ulrey. Rob's a great guy. He's an ICE agent now. And he was the one who really spearheaded a lot. You were talking about trauma and things like that. He spearheaded the idea of talking like openly and honestly about things like veteran suicide. And we were very much willing to push the envelope in terms of what was acceptable talk. And I don't mean that in a crass way. I mean, we were just upfront. We were willing to talk about any subject at all. And I think that, I did a lot to open up some of these things. Fast forward, Ranger Up kind of falls apart a little bit. I ended up working, doing some local things, but then I ended up where I am now, which is a company called Code Platoon. We talked a little bit about that. It's a software engineering boot camp, but it's specifically for military veterans. So right now I'm a recruiter who talks to people getting out of the service and they're looking for that next step. What do I do? I need a job, but I need a skill to have that job, launch a career. That's what we do at Code Platoon. So that's the summarized version.
Yeah.
Of course, like I said earlier, there's, having kids and families and,
right.
in the mix of all of that. So there's a lot more to that story, which are vastly important, of course, but that's a whole other story.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's another podcast for a different time.
Absolutely. It is.
Why do veterans, like you, a lot of veterans stay somehow in their vocational life in the veteran space, try to find a job, either serving veterans or hiring through a veteran program. For you, I guess you can't answer for everyone, but why have you stayed in the veteran space for so long?
Sure. And I can, I think all of us have to always be careful to answer from our perspective first.
Right, that's
make it known that, this is how I see it. I can speculate on how it works for everybody else. For me, I jokingly, but not jokingly, I keep coming back to that Al Pacino line in The Godfather where he says, they keep pulling me back in. It wasn't really a concerted effort. Like I never sat down and said, man, I really want to serve the veteran population. This is my heart that I'm dedicated to, and this is the only thing I want to do.
Yeah.
I'm not saying I don't have a passion for helping them. I do, but it was never something I explicitly set out to do. I just kept ending up in these roles where I'm continuously interacting with other veterans. Even when I took a local job, it was at a very large shooting range, and nearly everybody who worked on that range were veterans. It was just a big group of veterans doing, having the same conversations we were doing in Iraq.
Yeah.
But again, it wasn't that I set out to do it. It's just, and my theory is that I think a lot of people in this position find themselves being drawn back to it because it's familiar, number one. And number two, that's where your connections are.
Right.
The third reason, and this gets a little bit more esoteric, is I don't think that corporate America is as friendly to veterans as they claim. And I'm not saying they're openly hostile. Right. I'm saying that I think it's a lot harder for veterans to break into that corporate civilian world than the average TAPS class would have you believe.
Yeah.
What
makes it harder?
I think it's a radically different, well, a couple of things. I think people coming out of the military don't know all the proper steps of getting in. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is that I think a lot of corporate culture sees some of the things on some of our resumes and they're immediately hesitant.
Right.
Right. I mean, on my resume, I can say that I was at a Ranger battalion, I was a PSYOP guy, and I was a security contractor. That does, to a lot of HR managers, they're like, oh my gosh, what do I do with that? Right. Even though you and I know it's like, most of it's pretty benign, right? We learned a lot of leadership skills and things like that.
Yeah.
I think a lot of hiring managers see those things as not necessarily positive.
Yeah.
But there are other areas of the military that are very positive, and it just depends on where. Air Force officers seem to have no problem getting jobs.
I'm sure there's a reason for that. I just finished watching this series on Netflix, The Pacific. I don't know if you've watched that or not, but
yes,
great series. And so it's the last episode. One of the last scenes in the last episode is E.B. Sledge's character. He's trying to sign up for college classes.
Yes,
and this girl is sitting at the desk and she's interviewing him, right? And it's like, well, have you ever done this? Have you ever done this? Have you ever done this? And then she said, you were in the military. You were in the Marine Corps. Did you do this in the Marine Corps? No. Did you do this in the Marine Corps? He's like, no. Did you do this in the Marine Corps? You're with this whole list. And she said, well, wasn't there anything that you learned in the Marine Corps that can be helpful at this college? And if you've seen that scene, he leans across the table and he's kind of a nerdy guy, right? He's not like this big hulking Marine guy. He's like, he leans across the table and says, I'm really good at killing people. Or something like that, whatever that statement was. And she just looked at him. He turned around and walked away. And if you know E.B. Sledge, I'm sure that happened, but he became a professor and wrote and did a lot of important things, but it took him a long time. He couldn't figure out where his in was. And that's an extreme example. But yeah, to your point, I think a lot of veterans really do struggle with that. And maybe even this idea that I had this unit kind of cohesion thing, this brotherhood in the military, I'll have the same thing in my corporate job. And it just doesn't exist. It's just a different world.
Well, I don't think that it can. And I think that's part of the problem is that you internally, I think we all intuitively know that you'll never have that again, at least in the same way, right? You'll just never, that camaraderie that you have, especially in combat units, you know this, I know this, combat units have camaraderie that is just, you can't explain it to people who haven't been in it.
Right.
When you go into a corporate world, when they try to, I don't know if force is the right word, but when they try to foster camaraderie, it seems forced.
Yeah,
especially to people with our background, you go, that's not how that works.
Yeah, right.
That's not how any of this works. So I think that it immediately comes off as being kind of fake. So you're left with this dichotomy. Okay, do I buy into this kind of fake culture? Or like, what am I going to find that doesn't have that or that does have that? Yeah. And I think that's kind of what draws a lot of people back to that, helping other veterans kind of mindset of, okay, at least I can be around like-minded people. Even if I'm not doing the same thing, I'm at least around people who get it.
Yeah. Yeah, man, it's really interesting. And then I think even, going back to what you said earlier, you and others had to make it possible to have these conversations, right, about trauma and about post-traumatic stress and some of those things. Why did it take so long? Again, you were at the table. Why did it take so long for us to start having those real conversations? I mean, we came out of Vietnam, right? Like we go back further than that, but Vietnam was kind of ground zero for the broken veteran and our understanding culturally of the impact of war and combat and those things on homes and communities. Well, that was a long, long time ago, right? And then Iraq and Afghanistan, that's been going on for a long time too, and it's only been in the last 10 years or so that these conversations have, I don't say become okay, but really kind of become okay. Why is it taking so long for us to get there?
I think it's a couple of things. I think we're seeing in general, if we pull back, like big view, I think we're seeing a cultural shift in a lot of areas, not just there. I think we're seeing, it's one of those times in history where we're seeing a distinct change in how people talk about certain things, regardless of whether or not you agree with people's stance on X, Y, and Z topic. We're seeing a change in how they're talked about. And I think, and relating to this specifically, if you think about because when did you get out first? You got out
2003.
2003. Yeah. That's what I thought.
Yeah.
First time I got out in 2004. This is hard for younger people to imagine, and it's even hard for us to remember. But we have to remember that at that time, the internet was still young.
Yeah, right.
Right. The internet, we were still, as a culture, we're still looking at this internet thing going, what do we do with this?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we know it's a thing, it exists, but how do you use it as a tool for everyday life?
Yeah.
Now, fast forward, we take that for granted because it's like reading. Once you learn to read, you take it for granted because you read it all, you use it all the time. You're reading. You can't even remember what it was like to be illiterate. It doesn't even make sense.
Right.
Now it's like, what do you do without the internet? I don't know. I have no idea.
How do you function? Right. Yeah, exactly.
It's part of my everyday life. It's what we're doing right now. But I think that it took some time for us to adjust to that world of saying, oh, wait a second, like at Ranger Up, we have this ability to write a blog article about PTSD or suicide, and we can publish it and 10,000 people will read it.
Yeah.
And some of those people are heavily influential in the military community, and then maybe 50,000 people read it, and then maybe 100,000. And it's like, we were just kind of experimenting with that. You read back in the history of things like rock music, and it's like the 1950s and 60s. They're like, oh my gosh, you can plug a guitar in, and you've got electricity going through it, and it makes different sounds. Yeah. Like, what do we do with that? Well, now it's so common that you're like, yeah, of course you can do that, obviously. Yeah. So I think part of what you're asking there has to do with, first of all, figuring out that this internet thing, it's a real tool and you can use it for these reasons. But then second is recognizing the cultural shift that we're seeing in a lot of areas.
Right.
Not just ours, because I think it's connected. I don't think you can ever disassociate the military from the culture from which it came. I think that's a tendency and a temptation that we all have in the military to be like, well, we're different, we're separate. Not as much as you'd like to think. We're an extreme version of it.
So explain that a little bit.
So I think you can't ever, we start getting into kind of the esoteric, what a lot of people would think is esoteric. I don't think it's esoteric. Get into like religious concepts. What are religions but products of, and I don't want to say products because there is another dimension to it, but they come out of a culture, right? And they are a reflection of a culture. The military in a lot of ways is sort of a religious order because it's an ordered group. It's an ordered community that is ordered towards a higher good, right? Yeah. In the case of the U.S. military, it's to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Sure.
Okay, well, if it's drawn out of the population of the United States and it's set up to protect and defend the United States, then it has to, at some level, be reflective of the United States and be at least somewhat of a reflection of the values of the United States.
Right.
It can't ever be totally separate. And in the case of the United States, I think it's inherently cultural because of the nature of what we are. If you had some dictatorship, then yes, you can have a military that's almost like a separate country, right? It's a separate entity because you're using it on your own population. In the United States, it's not done that way. So it's inherently cultural. We are our culture. We're just a more extreme version of it in almost every regard.
Yeah, man, that's interesting. Yeah, we think about, I can't speak again to anyone else's experience, but definitely as Marines, right? Like when I was in the Marine Corps, we're Marines. We're not like anyone else. We don't answer to anyone else. We're different than everyone else. But the Marine Corps has changed so much. And talking to young people who are in the Marine Corps now, and and even older staff NCOs and officers, I mean, they'll talk about how much has changed because, to your point, culture's changed, and we draw our military from our culture. Man, fascinating. So these conversations we're having now, we can have in large part because culture is starting to have some of these, and even the tools exist that didn't exist before.
Right. Right. And so what I mean by culture changing and the conversation changing now, and this is not just me saying this, by the way, this is not my invention. Other people are saying this. 10 years ago, even 15 years ago, to mention the military in the context of religion, right? Me equating the military to a religion would have been seen as absurd, right? 15 years ago, most people would go, what? What are you talking about? Now, when I say these things, people go, oh yeah, I see it.
Sure.
And those things are opening up in ways that I couldn't have predicted 15 years ago, even as a student of these subjects. 15 years ago, I would have not predicted that we could be having these open conversations of saying, no, there's almost like a spiritual, cultural shift happening. And nearly everyone that you say that to goes, yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
It's not just this esoteric concept. Yeah. It's real. We're seeing things change. And I think you can't ever say that the internet is not a big part of that because it's the tool that we're using to have these conversations.
It's funny when, let's see, I don't even think I owned a computer at any point while I was in the Marine Corps. Maybe I did for a little while. I had like a word processor, one of those brother word processors where you could type it all out and then it would type it for you. I left the Marine Corps and went to work at a church. I took a ministry job. There were 4 of us on the staff team. We had one computer that we could all use. So yeah, I mean, things have changed so much. I didn't have a smartphone for many years. And so a lot of that has changed. And like with any other change in culture, there's good that comes with that and bad that comes with that. I think the good that comes with it is we can have these conversations, we can communicate more freely and openly and have actual dialogue. But there is something good to having almost that closed system that was the military that you and I came from.
Yes. No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that that's where this gets really tricky really quickly for people in our position. And I think, and this is how I see my role, is how do you help young people who come up in this world of the virtual interaction being so normalized, when we know from experience that there's nothing that can supplant that physical connection, right? The foxhole buddy, there will never be a closer friend, ever. Right? You cannot virtualize that and have it be the same thing.
Yeah.
But can we learn those lessons and help a next generation adapt to these technologies and say, hey, here's how we can use it for good.
That's good.
But recognize that there's limitations on what it can do. Yeah. You can't form a true community solely online. I don't think you can do that. There are a lot of people trying right now, and I don't think you can.
I was having a conversation. It's been over a year ago now. Time all runs together, but with Sergeant Major Kent, who was the Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps. He's on our board of advisors. He's been retired for a number of years now. But we were talking about changes in the military and specifically changes in the Marine Corps. And the question came up, when did you know that things were changing in the Marine Corps? And when did you start becoming concerned about it, right? So this was kind of the conversation. And he said, I became concerned when the DUI numbers started declining rapidly. It was a crazy answer. He said the DUIs, we weren't having office hours anymore. Marines weren't getting in trouble anymore, which is, obviously not true, right? Like there's still DUIs and Marines are still getting in trouble. But compared to when he was coming up and compared to when he was, battalion sergeant major and all those things, the numbers were dropping rapidly. I'm like, what are you talking about? How do you look at that as a bad thing? He said, well, the reason they're dropping is because Marines aren't leaving the rooms.
They're playing video games.
They have two Marine rooms. They're not in open squad bays anymore, so they're not connected to each other anymore. So they're playing video games, and we can't get them out of the rooms. And so unit cohesion has become a major issue because of exactly what you just said. And so it is that technology that makes a lot of things better. I mean, we would all agree, fewer DUIs is a good thing.
Right.
But
Absolutely.
But the reason for that unit cohesion that would come from fighting in bars in Oceanside and whatever, there's something to be said for that, right? And trying to understand that is I guess that's the question people are asking, is how do we understand that and work within that framework?
Well, I think, it goes back to, the stories that make the most sense, the things that move our culture and the things that we can resonate the most with are, as they say, the oldest stories in the book.
Yeah.
Well, the idea of using technology to shortcut the real aspect of life is a very, very old story.
Sure.
Right? I'm gonna not do the hard thing. I'm gonna do the easy thing
Right.
for a quick fix. And we're seeing a lot of that. And again, I think here, and this is hard, this is tricky, and I don't have the exact answers, but I think it's the responsibility of people in our positions to say, listen, this technology is a tool, but be very careful of how you use it and what you're using it for and what you're using it to replace, because it will never fully replace certain things.
Right. Yeah, that's good. So we had started talking about transition, and I think started talking about video games instead. So that was that was a fun little detour, but that speaks to transition, right? And so we have, a generation of people that are transitioning out of the Marine Corps without some of, I don't like the word things, right? But some of the things that we might have at one time had, closer families, closer communities, those things that military people could come into and maybe find some footing and, whatever. We don't have that as much as we once did, but we do have technology and other opportunities. I mean, you work for a company that provides opportunities in technology to veterans. How do people now, or how should people now prepare for this transition? You deal with this a lot. I deal with this a lot less. I'm focused on trauma and other things, but this transition is a major issue. You and I talked about this briefly before we started. I don't think anyone was talking about transition. I don't remember having these conversations until like 3 years ago. I mean, this is very new that we're talking about transition. Although internally we would say trauma is a big deal, post-traumatic stress is a big deal, but the bigger deal is people transitioning out of the military. So we were having these conversations, but they weren't these broad conversations. What do people need to do to transition well?
So I think a best way to approach that question is to say that I don't think that those things are separate at all. So I think the subjects that you're talking about with trauma and the concept of transition, I think are deeply connected.
Yeah.
And the reason for that has to do with what we started out talking about was this concept of purpose. What is your purpose? What are you following? What path are you following? And the loss of community. We can't, forget that that's a portion of trauma. Yeah. Right. And because I think it does a disservice to veterans in general to not mention that is somewhat traumatic. If you're in the military and you're in this insular community and it's almost like a family and you live with the same people for a couple of years and you do all the same things, and then suddenly you don't have that family anymore. Yeah. That I just defined a traumatic event. Yeah. Right. In any other context, people are like, oh, that's traumatic. Yeah. Right. Because you just lost your family. So, and for anybody watching, like, don't get me wrong, I'm not equating that to some more severe forms of trauma. It is hierarchical. Yeah, we can hierarchically differentiate. But I think that these things are somewhat, at some level, a bit shaking to our core. So I think the first thing, to me, what I see over and over again, the first thing with transitioning out is, number one, the recognition of what you are giving up. Now, that sounds obvious at first until you remember what I just said a minute ago, is that people often, they're only looking at the bad things in the military. Yep. Well, I've got somebody breathing down my neck. I got to tie my shoes a certain way. I've got to cut my hair a certain way. I got to shave, and I won't have to do that anymore. Okay, cool. But what are you giving up? You are giving up a lot. Whether you can still get out, and we all obviously decided to get out, but recognize what you're giving up and for what purpose. Starting to unpack that, I think, is huge. The other thing, and this just came up, this is fresh in my mind, so I'm curious to what you think about this. When you start looking at transitioning out of the service, people getting out of the military, be very careful about who you're getting advice from. I just had a prospective student tell me this the other day, and as soon as he said it, I thought, well, it's the most obvious thing in the world. He said, I had this gunnery sergeant. He's a Marine. He says, I had this gunnery sergeant telling me what I should do when I get out. He joined at 18 and he's like 30.
Yeah, right.
Like, what does he know about what to do in the civilian world? Sure. I mean, it's he meant well, and I'm sure that he had his best interests, but at the same time, the advice is coming from somebody who has not themselves done that thing. Yeah. So be careful. And this goes for the veteran community as a whole too. Like once you get out, who are you getting advice from? There's a lot of resources out there. Kind of what we're talking about. The downside of the internet is that there's almost too many resources.
Right. They say there are 44,000 veteran service organizations in the United States. I mean, that's, you can't even comprehend that, right? It's amazing.
You really can't. Yeah. You really can't. So you've got to kind of navigate that space. Figuring out how to navigate that space is a big part of this. But I think that a lot of that connects to this concept of, okay, what exactly am I doing? You know, we all had an idea of what we were getting into when we raised our right hand to join.
Yeah.
And then maybe we got in and it was different than we thought, or it wasn't, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Reflect on that as you're getting out and saying, okay, my intent is this. What does it actually look like? And what am I trying to accomplish with this? I talk to people who are coming to our school, all spectrums of this. I talk to people who have no idea what they're doing. And I talk to people who are dead set. They're like, I'm going to be a software engineer. That's what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
Guess which students do better?
Yeah.
Right. And I'm not knocking the people who don't have a clue what they want to do. Sometimes they do fine.
Sure.
But it's that longer process of figuring out, is this even the right thing for me?
Yeah.
I don't even know. And so that piece I think is huge, is recognizing why you're getting out. What is your purpose? What are you doing?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's a question that's just overlooked by a lot of people. They're dead set on, well, I got to get out of the military. Okay, that's fine. But then what?
That's why they all want to go back in, right? I mean, and it's kind of a joke, but it's true that 2 years after you get out, you just want to get back in. It's like someone who's been released from prison and now can't function in society, right? Like, I don't know. I carry the spoon around. I don't know why, right? Like, yeah.
It's a bit masochistic at some level. You're like,
I mean, you do become institutionalized. And to your earlier point, if you go in at 18 and you've spent your entire adult life in the military, I mean, there are some very high level thinkers that have spent their entire adult life in the military, but that doesn't also mean that you understand what it's like outside the military. You eat on a base, you shop on a base, you probably met your spouse on a base, right? Like everything about you is wrapped up in that world, unless you work very hard to get outside of that, which some people do. But what could the military do to help people transition better? So I got out in 2003, came back from Iraq. Our entire battalion was sent on basket leave, so everybody left. I was an officer, so when I went to the TAMP and TAP class, I showed up with my paper, and the staff sergeant who was running it said, "Oh, hey, sir, this is a 3-day class. Just let me sign your stuff, and you can go." So, which I appreciated at the moment, but in retrospect, I didn't know anything. I had no idea, and I didn't care, and I got to go home early. It was a terrible process. I think it's gotten better. But what can the military do, or could the military do to, let me scratch that question. What could people in the military do to better prepare for their transition? Because you and I can't influence probably policy in the military. But what can people who are transitioning right now, they're still in, they still have some time, maybe they've got a lot of time because of the leave they built up or something. What could they be doing right now to prepare themselves to transition?
That's a good question. And what I would do is I would answer. So the first question you were starting to answer, I'm going to answer that one simply because it makes sense when I answer the second question.
Yeah.
If I were king for a day,
right,
and I could say, hey, how could we change the policy? One of the biggest things I would do is to have someone at some level on bases who could translate what people did in the military into a relevant civilian experience.
Yeah.
That person doesn't exist. So therefore, it is incumbent upon you, the individual, to say, okay, I need to figure out, I did X in the military. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Because there are a couple of different paths you can come from that line of questioning. And I know, for the record, I know somebody out there might be watching and saying, no, there are people who can do that. They really can't. It's very, very difficult because there are so many military jobs that don't make sense.
And most of the people who are doing that job, I know some people who do, if you go on LinkedIn, you can find them. They just retired from the military. And so, and this is going to sound super condescending. I don't mean for it to be, but they're so good at translating their experience into civilian experience that they have created as their job telling other people how to translate their experience, right? They haven't done it themselves.
Right.
But yeah, and so again, to your earlier point, it's hard to come out of this institution and know how to guide other people into a world that could care less about your institution, right?
Right. And so I think from that line of questioning, I'm saying, okay, what I did in the military, what does it matter on the outside? Does it matter?
Yeah.
And the first line of questioning, so you can start developing these thought trees, right? So the first question you say is, okay, wait a second. Did I actually like doing what I did in the military? Because maybe something I was doing in the military translates very well. Maybe I was a mechanic. Yeah. I don't want to work on a single car the rest of my life.
Right.
So now what? Well, now you have to start going down the path of figuring out what you do want to do, in which case maybe it didn't matter and just the experience is going to help you, but that particular skill isn't. Or you did like doing what you did in the military, but that doesn't exist outside of the military. So what is something that is similar? What has the same fundamental concepts? Infantryman. I was an infantryman. You were an infantryman. Yeah. You can't do that on the outside.
Right.
That job doesn't exist.
Yeah. Not legally. Yeah.
Not legally. Right. Carry heavy weight for long distances and get shot at and eat bad food, eat cold food. Yeah. I don't think that exists. But you can start saying, okay, well, what are the fundamental components of this job that I did enjoy? And where does that apply in the civilian world? I think that's one of the biggest components of that transition of figuring out what you want to do is figuring out, okay, what did I do? Number one, what have I done already?
Right.
And does that experience translate? Does it not translate? If so, how? And I think that's where you start to unpack that. Again, like you said, there are people out there that kind of help veterans do that. These are not people who work at companies like Microsoft. Okay, they're just not. They're doing this as a job. They're helping people translate their service. The only realm I can think of it that's an exception is the heavy, like the defense contractor world.
Sure. Yeah.
Right? You go to those places and, Raytheon is hiring missile techs because they make missiles.
Right. Yeah.
McDonnell Douglas is hiring F-16 mechanics because they build F-16s. Right. So that kind of thing. And that translates really well. But outside of that, like, you've really got to figure out what you did and whether or not that experience is something you want to continue. And if so, how can you maximize it?
Yeah, that's good. I think a lot of people transitioning out of the military, the furthest they go in that process is saying, I want a job, right? I need to pay my bills. I want a job. And so where can I get a job? And that's just the wrong question to start with.
It really is.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
good. And that was a struggle for me. Maybe you could say in some ways it still is. I mean, I got out and my intent was to be a professor. Like that was what I wanted to do, was be a professor at a college. And the deeper I got into higher education, the less appealing that was.
Sure.
Especially as we started to see a lot of shifts in higher education and directions. I was like, boy, I don't know if this is the world I want to be in.
Yeah.
And since that time, it's been kind of up in the air. Like I said, the current job that I'm in is something that I stumbled into, quite literally, connection of a connection of a connection kind of thing. And suddenly I'm doing something that's great. Like, I love mentoring veterans getting out of the service and trying to help them decide whether or not this is the right path for them. Does that mean that that's my, end all be all goal? No.
Yeah.
But part of that is wrapped up in exactly what you said of, I got out with kind of a flawed view of what I thought I wanted to do. Once that gets upended, then nothing makes sense, nothing. And that's where I think a lot of veterans find themselves, is like, wow, I got out thinking that I could do a job and just be happy being out of the military and doing any old job. No, you're not, because you're going to deal with some of the same bureaucratic silliness.
Yeah.
Caused you to get out of the military.
What does that person who doesn't know what they want to do, but now they're faced with, I've got to do something, where do they go? Now, a lot of them end up in college. They use the GI Bill. I don't know what I'm going to do, so I'm going to go to college. And I don't know that is what you're saying earlier. The ones who really want to be coders, right? Like, they do really well. And the ones who, that's how college is, I think, for a lot of those folks, is they can do it and then get paid to do it. And so they do it almost as a job. So a lot go to college, a lot find, just the first job they can get a hold of, and they do that. What should they do? What's the tactic or the strategy if I don't know what I want to do with my life, but I need a job?
So I have two solutions for that. The first one, if we go back to this, we were talking about the internet and being upsides and downsides. Here's one of the upsides of the current world as it relates to the veteran space, is that there are numerous free career skills aptitude tests out there that you can take. And you can go through these tests, and they're kind of like these psychological tests that say, what do you like, this or this or this or this? And at the very end, it puts you in these kind of categories that say, you are more apt to do this, and that, I think, having those skills or those tests accessible and free is huge.
Yeah.
And they're getting really good with these tests. Is like, I've taken several of them and I get to the end and I go, oh yeah, that's true. I think that really is me. So there's a lot of resources out there. And again, a lot of them are free. So you can go and do these tests and start asking that question of, well, what am I good at? What would I be more inclined to do and be better at?
Yeah.
Because I think, and we can get more into this if you wanted to, this is probably a whole other podcast. There's a difference between what do I want to do and what am I good at? And I got news for the younger people. The thing that you're good at is where you're going to find more enjoyment over the long run.
Right.
There's a lot of people who think, well, I really want to be an NBA player. Okay, cool. You're not going to be.
Right.
So you wasting your time trying to be the next Michael Jordan, it's not going to happen. Right. So figuring out what you're actually good at is how you will eventually find your purpose. The second part that I would say is the harder of the two. That's the easy answer. That's the simple answer. Everybody can do that right now. If they're in front of a computer, dial up some of these tests and figure this out. The second one is harder because it's a more ancient method and it's the one none of us want to do. None of us want to go to somebody who's known us for like 30 or 40 years, like our parents, and go, hey, what do you think I should do?
Yeah.
Who should I be? Like, who am I? Because that's hard, right? We are inculcated with this American culture of I'm gonna create myself. I'm gonna be this bootstrap pulling, self-created man.
Right.
And the reality is that your parents probably know you better than you know yourself. And being a parent now, and I know you can relate to this. You see your kids, you're like, why are you? No, you're wrong.
Yeah.
That's not who you are.
Yeah.
Like, I know who you are. And you can see things miles away.
Yeah.
But that's really hard for us, right? Because it's a huge ego check to seek out. And maybe it's not your parent. Maybe it's not, it doesn't have to be a dad or a mom or somebody. It could be a figure who's just known you a very long time. As long as they have good intentions, they're probably going to have some really good insight into what you can be doing or should be doing.
They may also, and I haven't thought about this before, but they may also be able to uncover, undig some stuff that you used to talk about and that you wanted to do before you got, whatever motivated you to go into the military. Maybe you were talking about, being a welder or being a writer or whatever it was, and they can remind you of those things. So, man, that's great advice. Yeah, that's great advice.
It's huge. And I think that's where the military community can help each other out a great deal, because we have that mentoring system built in inherently. Right. We're more used to it than people outside the military, because you come up as a junior officer, you come up as enlisted, you're used to some senior figure telling you, like, this is what you should do. This is what you should do. So I think it's a little easier. But when we get out, then suddenly I think a lot of people start to revert back to that Americanism of I'm going to be a self-defined man, and this is who I want to be.
Yeah.
And I know people who got out. I'm certainly not going to name names, but I know people who got out who are colossally misguided about what their skills are.
Sure.
They're actually good at X, but they think that they're good at Y, and they are driving forward with Y, and they're miserable.
Well, I wonder how much of, some of it's American, what you just said. Some of it's that, right? But I wonder how much of it too is this veteran culture that, I rail against this all the time. This veteran culture that says, you don't know what it's like to be me. You don't know where I've come from. You don't know what I've experienced, and you can't tell me anything because, I was in the military for 4 years. So mom, dad, coach, whoever, there's nothing you can tell me because you didn't stand on the yellow footprints or whatever. And I fight against that all the time because I think it hurts us in a lot of areas. This is one area I have not considered it hurting us, but I wonder how much of it's that too, is like, well, I'd ask, but there's no one in my life I can ask because they don't know what it's like to, whatever.
Right. And
Yeah.
because it challenges the very core of who we are.
Yeah.
And when I say that this is, back to what we were talking about earlier with our culture being a reflection of our culture, there's an element of narcissism right now in our culture of
Yes.
it's all about me, right?
Yeah.
And social
Yeah.
media does not help this in any way. But did we freeze?
No, we're good.
Oh, there we go. Sorry about that.
That's right.
Edit that part out. We start down this path of like, me, and we've got a lot of things in our culture that foster that encourage it, that tell us to push further with it. And so the last thing that a lot of us want to do is reach out to that authority figure in our lives and say, hey, I need help. Maybe that's a pastor. Maybe it's a father figure. Maybe it's a mother, whatever. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you're seeking that from another human that you are in a relationship with that is so, and that gets back to that community thing that we miss in the military in the first place, right? That was the good part. That was the part that was the best part of the military. And when you get out, you lose it. So now you have to seek it out again. It's going to look different. It's not going to be the same because you're not going to be punching each other in the mouth after too many beers. Or maybe you are. I don't know. Some
probably not. Yeah, hopefully.
But you're going to be seeking out that community in a different way, and you've got to figure out how to let that help you. And that requires breaking down some barriers that we often don't want to.
It's funny talking about community. When I left the Marine Corps, I had a really hard time, and it was in transition. I've talked a lot about this, and part of me, this Jeremy, being able to move forward in my life was cutting ties with everyone I had served with. I didn't stay friends with anyone, and I didn't, I was proud of what we did, but that was it. I'm moving on. It took 10 years before I was reconnected. That's when I, met Chad Robichaux, who we both know, and all that went into that. I've told the story a lot, but the first person I think that ever had a conversation with me about this was Toby Nunn, who really well, and Toby was at the time very involved in Soldiers Angels, big veteran service organization at the time, and it was kind of on like he was kind of with you like on the edge, like the cutting edge of this, like let's help veterans helping veterans and all that before that was being talked about. And he was the first person really that talked to me about the need for community, military community, because I preached it like, I worked in a church, right? So community is something we talk about all the time, but like military community, I just had no concept that I needed that in my life. And then, through Toby and through Chad and you and people that came into my life at that time, and all of you kind of came into my life at the same time. I realized like this is all these struggles I've been having and this, this like inability to get ground and to move forward. So much of it goes back to not having this. And I didn't even know I needed it. Right. And it wasn't even just, I need people speaking into my life, but I needed to be able to speak into other people's lives too. And just that community it's so important. And if you don't have it, you just don't understand, I think, what it really impacts. And we're talking about transition and jobs and all that impacts all of those things. But even your relationships with your kids and with your spouse, we just don't get it. Like you can't leave the military and that not impact you. It will, and you have to be deliberate about how you navigate that.
You do, and it's a very hard thing to teach because we have lost sight of how to do that. Right? We come from a very long line of people who community was a forced thing. And I don't want to say forced. It was inherent in your entire culture, right? You talked about E.B. Sledge. Where did E.B. Sledge go back when he got out of the Marine Corps? Where did he go? Well, he went back to the family home and he stayed in that community. Why? Because you had to. You didn't go anywhere. That's just how your life worked. Well, now look at all of us. We're spread out all over the place. Even my own parents live 5 hours away. My sister lives 7 hours away. We're all spread out all over the place because we don't have that anymore. So you have to be deliberate in a sense that this hasn't really ever been done before, right? Fostering a community was just something you grew up in. That's where you were. If you grew up to be a blacksmith, your dad was a blacksmith, you were a blacksmith.
Right.
I have this whole thing, and this is something that's connected. Is you could do a whole podcast on the topic of imposter syndrome. That's just very common in the
Yes.
tech world right now. Well, I make the argument that the reason we even have imposter syndrome is because we're so detached from the end result of our work. Again, if you're a blacksmith, you know immediately whether or not your sword worked.
Yep.
You know whether or
Yep.
not the horseshoe worked. You saw the immediate results. Now we're divorced from the end result of our work. Whatever it is, it's many, many layers down the line, and we don't even see it. We don't know it. And it's not even being used in the community in which we're part. So whatever product I'm making,
That's good. Yeah.
which I'm not even making a product,
Yeah.
right? Whatever I'm doing isn't even attached to the people who live next door. They have no connection with that whatsoever. And so we start to feel like frauds because it's like, what am I even,
What am I doing?
what is the end result of what I'm doing? So I think all of that is connected to that concept of community, and being deliberate again is where I think we're responsible as the older, now, I hate to say it, but we're now the aging veterans,
Yes.
right? Who now have to be those mentors who say, okay, you need community, but how you go about that, you got to be deliberate and you got to be careful, because you can't just rush headlong into seeing any veteran service organization and be like, help me.
Right.
And they'll be like, give me a check.
Yeah. Right. They'll help you. All right. Yeah, man, that's good. Man, there's so much good here. We need to have another conversation and talk some more.
By all means.
There's a lot to unpack still, and
Indeed.
most of the questions I had I didn't get to. So we're gonna do this again. But until we can do the next one, tell people where they can find you if they're interested in the work that you're doing right now. Where they can follow you, whatever you want to push out there.
Yeah. So again, I work for Code Platoon, and that can be found at codeplatoon.org. It's a nonprofit, veteran-focused coding boot camp. We train people to be software engineers who get out of the military. It is skill bridge eligible for any of you who are still in the military and you want to do it as you're transitioning out. That's a whole other subject that we could have a discussion on. But at any rate, we are skill bridge eligible. We're registered with the VA. It's a nonprofit. We're in the process, not the process. We're in the business of launching careers. That's our goal, is to get people's careers started in the world of software engineering, software development, giving hard skills. So if you have any questions about that, anybody can reach out to me at any time, because I'm the recruiter. I'm the one you talk to anyway. Email me at Greg, Greg at codeplatoon.org. But I'm happy to talk to anybody about anything. As Jeremy can tell you, I'm not a no pressure person in terms of I'm not going to sell you on Code Platoon. You either want to be a software engineer or you don't. We have a lot of free stuff that can enable you to test that. So if you end up saying, hey, I'd rather be a truck driver, cool. Good for you. You found your purpose, and go for it. But I'm happy to talk to anybody about anything.
It's funny, when I was in the Marine Corps, I remember seeing the become a truck driver signs up all over the barracks. That was the thing, right? That was a long time ago.
It was fresh in my mind because I had somebody just tell me that. He was a Marine too. And he says, he's like, tried the intro to coding course, and he says, I'm just going to go be a truck driver. I was like, that's good, man. That's awesome.
Makes sense because he saw the signs in the barracks.
I think that's what it is. That's what it is.
Yeah. So reach out to Greg and then follow him on Facebook, because he'll always post thought-provoking questions that create a stir. We'll say a stir, but not always. Sometimes they don't.
I try to avoid debate these days. I try to avoid any contentious debate. I'm curious about how people learn. So
you avoid debate by not engaging, but you drop the bomb in the room and let everybody else deal with it. So I've noticed that's your new your new kind of tactic. But
my new direction.
But it's good, man. Thanks for coming on and talking. We definitely need to do this again. There's a lot more to unpack, but I appreciate it. It's good to connect. We've stayed in contact, but good to see each other face to face, even virtually, because this is how the world operates now. But
this is where we are.
This is where you are.
It's better than not connecting at all. That's
better than not connecting at all, and it's helpful. So thanks, Greg. Appreciate it.
Well, thanks, Jeremy. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Grateful for that conversation, and Greg and I are going to have another conversation. We started off with a list of topics we wanted to cover, and I don't think we got to any of them. So we're going to come back to that, and look forward to having him back on. But man, particularly for those of you that are in the military or are transitioning out of the military, Great content for you. Reach out to Greg. There are a few people who have been in this space a long time and really get it. And he's one of those people. And maybe you're interested in what he's doing now, but maybe you just have questions. I know he'd be happy to talk to you. So reach out to him. And I know that would be a help to you. Take some time. Go over to Life Audio, lifeaudio.com. Great podcast there. Great conversations happening there. That will be a blessing to you. So please check those out. And finally, go to marchordie.com if you have not yet been there, marchordie.com. Check that out. Go to the store. Some great stuff there for you to take a look at as well. And I would appreciate it if you would do that. Subscribe if you have not yet subscribed. Share this content out with others. And finally, we look forward to seeing you next time.
Many of our veterans feel they need to fight their battles alone. This self-isolation has led to the staggering statistic of more than 20 veterans taking their lives every day. The mission of Mighty Oaks is to eradicate the veteran suicide epidemic and help our warriors change their legacies. We've been able to help over 4,000 veterans and first responders by equipping them with the tools they need to live the lives they were created to live. Our faith-based, peer-to-peer approach has one of the highest success rates of any program available today, offering hope and understanding to those who need it most. By aligning their lives to biblical principles, these men and women are able to lead their families, their communities, and our nation. It's your generosity that can make a difference in the lives of the men and women who have fought for our country and our freedoms. Now that they're home, don't let them fight alone. Learn more at mightyoaksprograms.org.